Welcome back, my dear friends, my fellow travelers through the worlds where literature and cinema entwine. It's always a joy to sit down with you, knowing that what we share here is not a shallow swim across the surface of stories, but a deep dive into the undercurrents, those meanings, those resonances, those truths that are not always said aloud but are always there, waiting. Today, I want to turn our gaze towards Stolen, Heist of the Century, 2025, though I should tell you immediately, as I always do in these spaces, that what you're about to hear is not a conventional movie review. I'm not here to tell you whether to buy tickets or how many stars critics might assign. What I want to share with you is something far more personal and, I hope, valuable. An intellectual and theoretical exploration, crafted especially for those of you who read films the way others read novels, tracing the language of images, motifs, and themes as if they were poetry. And if that sounds like the kind of journey you'd like to keep taking with me, then I'd be honored if you'd like this video and subscribe, not out of routine, but because each new exploration becomes richer when we share it together. I think what draws me so strongly to this particular story is not merely its clever premise, a heist, a theft that promises to be more than crime, but something closer to performance art, but the way it echoes the truths I've felt about life itself. I've always been fascinated by the idea of theft, not in the crude sense of possessions taken, but in the more haunting ways that time, circumstance, and inevitability rob us. When I watch a film that stages a robbery, what I really see is a metaphor for survival, for the games we play against systems larger than ourselves. Perhaps you've felt it too, that your days sometimes resemble elaborate plans, intricate strategies designed not to steal but to protect, to endure. That's why this film resonated with me so powerfully. It's not only about what is stolen, but about the costs of stealing, the bruises left behind in both body and soul. The film introduces itself with an elegance that almost deceives. We are lulled at first into believing we are watching a straightforward heist, the familiar rhythm of planning, assembling, executing. But then slowly, we realize it is not about the mechanics at all. What matters is not how the safe is cracked or how the alarms are disarmed, but why these people would risk everything for the prize. Their motivations are never simple greed. They are desperation, longing, defiance, even love. And so the heist becomes less an act of theft and more a question. What do we believe is worth sacrificing everything for? It's a question I've found myself asking in my own life, though in quieter, less cinematic ways. When I've chosen paths that meant losing comfort for the sake of meaning, when I've gambled stability for the chance at authenticity, was I not, in my own way, staging a heist against the predictable, against the expected? The overview of the film reveals a structure that is both classic and subversive. On the surface, it mirrors the old traditions of crime thrillers, assembling the crew, sketching out the blueprint, rehearsing the impossible. Yet beneath that surface lies a far more layered narrative. Each character brings not only their skill but their wounds. The driver is not just someone who knows the streets, but someone who has spent years trying to outrun his past. The strategist is not merely clever, but is haunted by a failure no one else speaks of. The insider, who provides the key to entry, does so not out of loyalty, but out of a fractured sense of revenge. In these layers, the film reveals itself as less about crime than about literature, about archetypes reshaped into human beings carrying contradictions. It reminded me of how Shakespeare's tragedies function. Characters caught not only by circumstance, but by their own flaws, driven to decisions that are both inevitable and heartbreaking. The plot itself unfolds with a rhythm that is deceptively familiar. The crew comes together in dimly lit bars and abandoned warehouses, their conversations sharp and whispered. Plans are drawn on napkins, revised on blackboards, tested in quiet rehearsals under the cover of night. The tension grows not from whether the alarms will sound, but from whether these fractured people can hold together long enough to reach their prize. When the night of the heist arrives, the city itself seems to tremble. Rain falls in thin, unrelenting sheets, neon bleeds across wet pavement, and the air feels heavy with anticipation. Watching it, I couldn't help but remember nights from my own life when anticipation pressed so hard against my chest that breathing felt like a luxury. Not that I was ever staging a heist, but haven't we all had nights where everything seemed to hinge on what we dared to risk? The film's pacing is masterful, teasing us with moments of triumph before cutting them away with sudden turns. Just when it seems the plan might succeed, fractures appear. A look exchanged between two crew members reveals distrust. A clock ticks too quickly, throwing the schedule off balance. A locked door, dismissed as a minor obstacle, becomes a cavernous threat. These details matter more than explosions or car chases, because they remind us that human frailty is always the true danger. What fascinated me most was how the narrative refused to glamorize the heist. Yes, it was thrilling, but it was also suffocating. Each victory was tinged with dread, each escape felt temporary, each smile a mask stretched over fear. And then come the twists, the turns that make this story linger long after the credits. One by one, the secrets each crew member carried rise to the surface, loyalties fracture. The strategist who seemed untouchable falters at the worst possible moment. The insider once trusted reveals motives that destabilize everything. The driver, the quietest of the group, becomes the hinge on which the plan turns, his choices rewriting the destiny of them all. These revelations are not delivered with bombast but with quiet devastation. I felt them like aftershocks, subtle yet powerful, leaving me uneasy even in silence. And at the center of it all is the question that echoes beyond the screen. What is truly stolen here? Is it money, jewels, art? Or is it time, dignity, trust? The answer, of course, is all of these. What I admire most about the storytelling is how it places us not above the characters but beside them. We feel their breath quicken, their doubts rise, their hands tremble. The cinematography insists on intimacy, close shots that press us into their unease, shadows that swallow their outlines until we cannot tell whether they are emerging or disappearing. Symbolically, the use of reflections, faces fractured in mirrors, plans scribbled on glass, reminds us that nothing here is whole, nothing stable. And perhaps that is the truest theft, the stealing of certainty. For me, personally, this film connected to something I have felt about the fragility of trust. I thought about times in my own life when I placed faith in people, only to discover their motives were not what I believed. Watching these characters unravel in betrayal reminded me of those moments, not with bitterness but with recognition. It is a universal wound, isn't it? That trust is always at risk of being stolen. And yet the film does not leave us in despair. There are glimmers, small, almost imperceptible, of loyalty, of sacrifice, of choices made not for greed but for love. They remind us that even in betrayal, humanity endures. As the story closes, we are not offered the neat catharsis of victory or failure. Instead, we are left with ambiguity. Some characters escape, but their freedom feels fragile. Others are caught, but their downfall carries a strange dignity. The heist itself, whether successful in material terms or not, becomes secondary. What matters is what it reveals about the people who dared to attempt it. And as the credits rolled, I found myself reflecting not on the jewels or the vaults but on the weight of choices, the scars of compromise, the cost of survival. This, to me, is the brilliance of the film. It takes a genre often dismissed as formulaic and turns it into something closer to literature. It becomes not a tale of crime, but a parable of existence. It insists that theft is not only what happens in banks or museums, but what happens to all of us, every day. Our time stolen by systems that demand too much, our innocence stolen by betrayals we did not foresee, our certainty stolen by the unpredictability of life itself. And yet, it also reminds us that even in this endless cycle of loss, we carry within us the capacity for resilience, for defiance, for connection. That is why this film mattered to me, why it lingers in my thoughts even now. It did not give me answers, but it gave me questions, and in those questions I found myself. Perhaps you did too, or perhaps you will when you see it, not as a thriller, but as a meditation. So as we close this exploration together, I want to thank you, as always, for choosing to walk with me into the depths of cinema. I know you could be anywhere else, watching lighter fare, scrolling through endless noise. But here you are choosing to think, to feel, to interpret. That choice means more than I can say. If this conversation has stirred something in you, if you find value in treating films like texts and images like metaphors, then I would love for you to join me again. Subscribe if you haven't already, not because it's the polite thing to do, but because I believe we are building something rare here, a community of readers of film, a fellowship of minds who see in cinema the same richness we see in literature. And so we continue together, not for escape but for recognition. The night always comes, the vaults are always locked, the risks are always high, but still we keep watching, keep reading, keep reflecting. Until next time, my friends, thank you for being here, thank you for thinking deeply, and thank you for carrying these questions forward into your own lives. The story begins with a city that hums like a restless animal, alive with too much noise and too many secrets. Its skyline gleams with glass and steel, but down below, in the corners where light falters, there are stories most people would rather not see. The film places us in those corners immediately, where desperation walks hand in hand with ambition. The first thing we notice is not the grandeur of wealth but the fatigue of those who circle it, the way a moth circles flame, drawn in despite knowing it may burn. And it is in this pulse of contradiction, this city that both promises and betrays, that we meet the protagonist. He does not announce himself with heroism, but with quiet tension. We see him in an ordinary space, a cluttered apartment where bills pile up and the hum of the refrigerator seems louder than it should. He leans over a table littered with receipts, old photos, fragments of a life that never quite assembled the way it should have. His hands move restlessly, folding, unfolding, scribbling notes in the margins of a notebook already filled with sketches of blueprints, of hallways, of vault doors. The atmosphere tells us more than dialogue could. This is a man who has been planning for too long, who has been circling an idea that threatens to consume him. The first development comes quietly, like an ember before the fire. A phone call interrupts his restless scribbling, and on the other end is a voice that feels both familiar and dangerous. This voice speaks in code, not about theft or crime, but about opportunity and timing. We know without needing to be told that this is the spark. The protagonist's face hardens, not with excitement but with inevitability, as though he has been waiting for this call and dreading it in equal measure. He hangs up and stares at the mirror, the reflection fractured by a crack across the glass, his own face split into pieces. That crack becomes a quiet metaphor, a reminder that what follows will fracture not only the city's treasures, but the lives of everyone involved. The assembling begins. One by one, we meet the figures who will become the crew, each introduction delivered with cinematic patience. There is the driver, first glimpsed behind the wheel of a battered car, maneuvering through traffic with unnerving calm. His story emerges not in words but in scars, the way he grips the steering wheel too tightly, the way his eyes flick to the rearview mirror as though haunted by what chases him. Then there is the strategist, a sharp-eyed figure who lives in a cluttered apartment lined with books and maps. His brilliance is matched only by the unease in his posture, as though knowledge itself has become a burden. He speaks quickly, precisely, mapping out possibilities that sound less like plans and more like prophecies. The insider comes later, introduced in the fluorescent glow of an office where wealth is stored and guarded. She moves quietly, efficiently, a figure whose presence is designed to go unnoticed. But in the small gestures, the hesitation before unlocking a drawer, the furtive glance toward a surveillance camera, we glimpse the war inside her. She is not here because she wants to be, but because circumstances have made her part of the machine. Her inclusion is both the plan's brilliance and its most dangerous fragility. The early events unfold with a rhythm that mirrors literature more than spectacle. Meetings take place in dim bars, their conversations layered with subtext. Plans are sketched on napkins, erased, redrawn, revised. The crew gathers in warehouses where the sound of dripping water becomes a metronome, keeping time with their ambitions. Each moment builds tension not by shouting its stakes but by whispering them. We understand that every move is rehearsed, every gesture calculated, and yet the fragility of it all lingers like a shadow over their shoulders. The first rehearsal is a turning point. They test their timing, practicing entry and exit, their movements synchronized but uneasy. The driver times the route, whispering seconds under his breath. The strategist checks angles of cameras, marking blind spots with chalk on the warehouse floor. The protagonist oversees it all, his face set with determination that barely conceals his fear. It is during this rehearsal that the first crack in their unity appears. The insider falters, her hands trembling as she simulates opening a lock. Silence falls heavy, the others watching her with eyes that judge but also fear. She forces a smile, insists she can handle it, but the seed of doubt has been planted. Meanwhile, the city breathes around them, its rhythm becoming part of the story. Rain falls often, painting the streets in neon reflections. Crowds move through marketplaces with indifference, unaware that plans are unfolding in the shadows. There is a scene where the protagonist stands alone on a bridge, watching the water churn below. His face is lit by passing headlights, his thoughts unspoken, but the imagery tells us enough. This is not only about stealing wealth, it is about reclaiming something he feels was stolen from him long ago. The film begins layering in personal stakes, weaving each character's backstory into the heist. The driver's past surfaces when a figure from his old life appears unexpectedly, reminding him that debts of his own remain unpaid. The strategist's obsession with precision is revealed to come from a previous failure, one that cost lives, a failure he cannot forgive himself for. The insider's tension is shown to be rooted in her family's vulnerability. She is trapped, working not for greed but for survival. These developments deepen the plot, transforming the heist from spectacle into tragedy in waiting. We begin to understand that the real story is not whether they will succeed, but what the attempt will cost them. Key events begin to accelerate. A test run through the city reveals flaws in their timing, forcing them to rethink routes. An unexpected police patrol interrupts their surveillance, leading to a tense moment where the crew scatters into shadows, holding their breath until danger passes. The strategist grows increasingly tense, his need for control clashing with the unpredictability of reality. The protagonist, meanwhile, grows quieter, his resolve hardening into something almost dangerous. His silence becomes its own kind of leadership, unsettling in its intensity. Then comes the first betrayal of trust, small but significant. The insider withholds a detail about new security measures, only revealing it when cornered. The crew's anger is sharp, but beneath it is fear. They realize how precarious their plan truly is. The strategist demands changes, the driver grows restless, and the protagonist steps between them, reminding them that the plan is not just about wealth but about survival. This moment crystallizes their fragility, reminding us that the heist is built not only on skill but on the thin thread of trust. The atmosphere grows heavier as the night of the heist draws closer. The crew gathers one final time in the warehouse, the air thick with unspoken doubts. They rehearse once more, their movements precise but their eyes betraying unease. The protagonist delivers a few words, not a rousing speech, but a quiet reminder of why they are here. His words land not as inspiration but as inevitability. They are past the point of return. The story leads us into the night itself, the air thick with rain, the city glowing with neon like a stage set for tragedy. Cars move through the streets, their engines' low hums against the silence of anticipation. The crew takes their positions, each step measured, each breath heavy. The camera lingers on their faces, capturing the fear, the defiance, the exhaustion. And as they move toward the vault, toward the center of their plan, we know that every detail we have followed, the rehearsals, the betrayals, the compromises, has brought them here. It is here in this suspended moment, before everything unravels, that the story's tension is most potent. We are not watching criminals chasing wealth. We are watching human beings risking everything against inevitability. And though the night is just beginning, though we know chaos is waiting, the silence before the storm carries its own weight. It tells us that the heist is no longer a plan on paper. It is alive, unfolding, irreversible. And in that realization, the audience leans closer, knowing that what comes next will change everything. The night of the heist does not explode into motion the way stories usually do. It begins with silence, the kind that clings to the air so tightly it feels like sound itself has been stolen away. The city is wet with rain, its reflections stretching across the streets like veins of light, and every small detail, the drip of water from a rooftop, the click of shoes against pavement, the static hum of a distant neon sign, becomes amplified. The crew moves like ghosts through these streets, each step rehearsed but now weighted with the undeniable truth that rehearsal has ended. This is no longer practice. It is the moment when imagination becomes reality, when every decision echoes far louder than its sound. The driver waits outside in a car that looks too ordinary to be anything but suspicious. His hands grip the wheel in a way that betrays nerves he does not allow to touch his face. The strategist checks his watch again and again, each tick louder in his mind than the falling rain. The insider slips through corridors, her badge granting her access to doors that now feel heavier than ever before. And at the center of it all is the protagonist, his silence commanding the others more powerfully than any speech could. This silence has become his language, his way of telling them that hesitation is no longer an option. They make it inside with unnerving ease. Doors open, cameras blink off for just the right moments. The plan, so fragile in rehearsals, now unfolds like clockwork. But the audience knows, as the characters surely do, that ease is often the prelude to collapse. The vault looms ahead, massive and indifferent, a symbol not only of wealth but of everything that divides them from freedom. The insider's hands tremble as she works the final lock, her breath uneven, her face pale. The strategist hovers, whispering instructions she already knows, his need for control eroding her concentration. And then, with a click that reverberates through the silence, the door yields. Inside, the wealth glows in muted light. Stacks of bills, jewels that glint with cold fire, priceless art stored like forgotten relics. It is the sight they have been chasing, yet instead of triumph, unease swells in the room. Each of them stares not at treasure but at temptation, at promises that could ruin as easily as save. The protagonist moves quickly, instructing them to load only what was planned, no more, but greed does not respect planning. The strategist's eyes linger too long on a painting. The driver, having left his post to help, clutches more than was agreed. The insider falters, caught between fear and desire. What was once a precise choreography becomes dissonance, a dance out of rhythm. The first twist arrives not with alarms blaring but with the absence of alarms. The crew realizes too late that silence itself is betrayal. They were expected. As they load their haul, shadows emerge from the corners, figures who should not be there. Security guards, but not the kind who stumble, they move with precision, with awareness as though they have been waiting, and in that moment the betrayal comes into focus. The insider had not told them everything. She was never fully theirs. Her motives, hidden in fragmented glimpses of her family's vulnerability, surface now in a way that reshapes everything. She did not betray them entirely, but she betrayed them enough, and that fracture is all it takes. Chaos erupts. The strategist panics, shouting orders that contradict the protagonist's calm directives. The driver fights his way back to the car, torn between loyalty to the crew and the instinct to save himself. The insider, cornered by her own divided loyalties, freezes. The protagonist becomes the anchor, pulling them through each unfolding disaster with forceful decisions. He cuts through indecision like a blade, his voice low, commanding. For the first time we see him not as weary or inevitable, but as terrifyingly alive. They escape the vault, but not without cost. Shots ring out in the corridors, echoing like thunder. A member of the crew, not one of the central figures, but someone who had been with them through every rehearsal, is struck down. His fall is quiet, his body folding into the shadows, but its weight crushes the others. Death was always a possibility, but its arrival fractures the illusion that survival is inevitable. The strategist falters, shaken, his calculations collapsing under the burden of guilt. The driver nearly leaves, his loyalty breaking under the weight of fear, but the protagonist pulls him back, his grip fierce, reminding him that abandonment is a death of its own. The getaway becomes the story's heartbeat. The city, once indifferent, now feels hostile. Sirens slice through the night, headlights flare like accusations, streets narrow as though trying to trap them. The driver's hands, once steady, now tremble as he maneuvers through alleys, his eyes flicking to mirrors that reveal pursuers gaining ground. The strategist clutches the hall, his obsession making him reckless. The insider stares out the window, tears streaking her face, torn between relief and devastation. And the protagonist, seated in the back, watches it all with an expression unreadable, as though he already knows how this night will end. The next twist unfolds in betrayal layered upon betrayal. The strategist, consumed by greed and fear, insists they split immediately, that trust is no longer possible. His voice rises, his arguments sharp, his paranoia infectious. The protagonist listens in silence, his calm more unnerving than anger. When he finally speaks, it is with a clarity that cuts through the chaos. If we fracture now, we are already dead. But the strategist does not listen. At the first opportunity, he abandons the crew, taking a portion of the hall with him. This moment shatters the fragile unity, leaving the remaining trio with nothing but fragments of trust. Their path narrows to inevitability. Police close in, roads are blocked, safe houses turn out to be compromised. Each step forward becomes a gamble, each decision heavier than the last. The driver, loyal despite his fear, stays at the wheel, his skills the only reason they remain ahead. The insider, her betrayal partially redeemed by her refusal to abandon them now, works to undo the damage she caused. And the protagonist, scarred by loss and betrayal, holds them together by sheer force of will. The climax arrives not in triumph but in collapse. They reach what should have been their escape point, a quiet dock where a boat was meant to wait, but the boat is gone. Whether taken by the strategist, seized by authorities, or never real to begin with, we do not know. The emptiness of the dock becomes the ultimate betrayal, the cruel reminder that plans are fantasies, that control is an illusion. Surrounded, with sirens closing in, the protagonist makes his final decision. He orders the driver and the insider to flee, to save themselves with what little they can carry, while he remains behind. His reasoning is never fully explained, but the truth is visible in his eyes. Someone must pay the price, someone must anchor the collapse, and he has chosen to bear it. The resolution is not clean. The driver and the insider escape into the night, their futures uncertain, their lives forever scarred. The strategist's fate is left ambiguous, his greed perhaps his undoing, perhaps his salvation. And the protagonist, cornered at the dock, is swallowed by shadows as the authorities close in. Whether he is captured, killed, or disappears into the night is left unanswered, the ambiguity deliberate. The story does not give us neat endings because life rarely does. What lingers after the climax is not the question of who survived or who fell, but the haunting weight of what was lost. The money, the jewels, the treasures, all of it pales against the cost of trust, loyalty, and humanity. The crew began as fragments of desperation stitched into a plan, and they ended as fractured as they began. Yet in those fractures, in the betrayals and sacrifices, lies the truth the film has been whispering all along. That heists are not about what is taken, but about what is left behind. The final images reinforce this truth. The driver sits alone in his car, rain streaking the windshield, his hands still gripping the wheel as though unable to release the night's weight. The insider walks through a quiet street, her face a mask of sorrow, her steps unsteady. And the protagonist's absence becomes the most powerful presence of all, a void that echoes louder than any survival could. The story closes not with victory, not with failure, but with haunting ambiguity, the sense that what was truly stolen was never gold or jewels, but certainty itself. In this way, the film delivers its final twist. It refuses us the comfort of resolution, offering instead a mirror to our own lives, where plans fracture, trust collapses, and survival itself is often the only prize. The climax is not in the vault, not in the escape, not in the dock, but in the realization that theft, betrayal, and endurance are universal. The resolution is not closure but continuation, a reminder that stories do not end, they linger, they echo, they haunt. And so the film leaves us with silence again, the same silence with which it began, but this silence is different. It is heavier, shaped by everything we have witnessed, carrying the weight of inevitability. It is the silence of aftermath, of questions left unanswered, of lives forever altered. It is a silence that insists on being carried, long after the screen has gone dark. The story's pulse is carried not by the spectacle of the heist itself, but by the people who risk everything to see it through. Each figure arrives on screen as more than just a piece of a puzzle. They are human beings marked by history, scarred by choices, and driven by desires that clash as often as they converge. To understand the film fully, we have to linger with these characters, to step into their contradictions, their betrayals, and their fleeting moments of loyalty. Their humanity is what transforms the narrative from a clever crime thriller into something closer to tragedy. At the center stands the protagonist, a man whose silence speaks louder than words. From the earliest scenes, we see in him not excitement but inevitability. He is someone who has been circling this plan for too long, haunted by debts both financial and personal, carrying the weight of losses that are never named but always felt. His face carries fatigue like a second skin, his movements deliberate, his words rare but piercing when they come. He is not a visionary in the romantic sense, nor a charismatic leader. He commands not through inspiration but through gravity, through the way others recognize in him a refusal to falter. Yet his strength is also his curse. He internalizes everything, locking away fear, regret, even hope, until his silence becomes almost suffocating. By the film's end, when he chooses to remain behind as others flee, his arc crystallizes. He is a man defined by sacrifice, a figure who carries the weight of the plan until it crushes him. His presence lingers even in absence, reminding us that the heist was never about money for him, but about reclaiming dignity that life had already stolen. Beside him is the driver, a man whose loyalty feels as fragile as it is profound. Introduced behind the wheel of a battered car, he seems at first to be defined by skill, someone whose control over machines offers a kind of stability, but beneath his calm lies a restless fear. He is a man who has lived a life of flight, always looking into mirrors, always ready to accelerate away from the past. His loyalty to the protagonist is not born of admiration, but of recognition. They are both men carrying histories too heavy to name. The driver's arc is one of hesitation turned into reluctant commitment. Time and again, he thinks of leaving, of saving himself before the net closes in, but he stays. His decision to remain until the end, even as the plan fractures, is his act of defiance. He is not brave in the conventional sense. He is brave because he acts against his own fear, because he chooses loyalty when survival whispers otherwise. And in that choice he becomes one of the film's most quietly moving figures. The strategist is the foil to both protagonist and driver, a man defined not by silence or loyalty, but by obsession. His mind is sharp, his calculations precise, his presence always taut with tension. He thrives in rehearsals, in planning, in the illusion that control can conquer chaos, but his brilliance is inseparable from his fragility. We learn of a failure in his past, a mistake that cost lives, and from that moment on, his obsession with precision becomes not ambition but penance. Every map, every diagram, every clock he checks is an attempt to undo a mistake that cannot be undone. This makes him fascinating but also dangerous. When the plan falters, his need for control unravels into paranoia. His betrayal, when he abandons the crew and takes part of the haul, is less about greed than about his inability to face chaos again. His tragedy is that his intelligence, the very quality that makes him indispensable, is also the quality that destroys him. He cannot bear ambiguity, and so he fractures when ambiguity overwhelms him. The insider is perhaps the most complex character, a woman whose role in the story oscillates between savior and betrayer. At first she seems like the weakest link, her hands trembling in rehearsals, her eyes darting toward cameras, her hesitation betraying fear. But as her backstory unfolds, we see that her motives are tangled not in greed but in survival. Her family is caught in vulnerabilities she cannot escape, and her betrayal of the crew, revealing just enough to outside forces to compromise them, is born of desperation. Yet she is not entirely lost to betrayal. When the chaos erupts, she remains, refusing to flee entirely, trying to atone in ways that are too little, too late. Her arc is one of divided loyalties, of a heart pulled in opposite directions. She is neither villain nor hero but painfully human, embodying the film's central truth that survival often demands choices that cannot be clean. Audiences may judge her harshly, but her contradictions are what make her unforgettable. The fallen crew member, though not central, plays an essential symbolic role. His death, quiet and almost overshadowed by the chaos, carries disproportionate weight. He is the reminder that every heist, every plan, no matter how carefully designed, exacts a cost. His absence hangs heavy in the later scenes, not because he was deeply developed, but because he was one of them, part of the fragile web of trust. His fall reminds the others, and us, that these stories are not glamorous but tragic, that the losses are real, and that the pursuit of wealth often leaves graves in its wake. The antagonists, though less individualized, embody systemic menace. The security forces who appear at the vault are not bumbling guards, but figures who move with precision, as though the heist had been anticipated from the start. Their presence strips the heist of triumph, reminding us that power structures are always prepared to defend themselves. Yet they are not caricatures. They are professional, methodical, chilling in their calm. Their menace lies in their efficiency, in their refusal to be surprised. They are less characters than symbols of the systems the protagonists are trying to defy, systems that seem faceless yet all-seeing, indifferent yet omnipresent. Even secondary characters, bartenders in dimly lit bars, market vendors who scold the insider for clumsiness, strangers who brush past the crew without realizing the weight of their secrets, play their part in deepening the narrative. They remind us of the ordinariness against which the heist unfolds. The world continues while the crew gambles everything, indifferent to their risks. These figures underscore the loneliness of the protagonist's choices, the way their lives fracture away from the normal rhythms of society. What unites these characters is not their ambition, but their contradictions. The protagonist is strong yet suffocatingly silent. The driver is loyal yet consumed by fear. The strategist is brilliant yet destroyed by his own obsession. The insider is vulnerable yet capable of betrayal. Each of them embodies the fragility of trust, the inevitability of compromise, the impossibility of clean survival. Together, they form a tapestry of human weakness and resilience, a reminder that stories of crime are never really about wealth, but about the people who risk themselves for it. By the end, what lingers is not the question of who survived or who escaped, but the haunting realization of what each character lost. The protagonist loses himself in sacrifice. The driver loses innocence in loyalty. The strategist loses dignity in betrayal. The insider loses trust in survival. The fallen member loses life itself. The antagonists lose nothing, because they were never risking anything. These arcs weave together into a conclusion that is not neat, but devastatingly human. The brilliance of the film lies in how it refuses to let us categorize its characters as heroes or villains. They are not archetypes but contradictions. They remind us that in desperate circumstances, everyone is both capable of betrayal and capable of loyalty, that survival is never clean, and that dignity often comes at unbearable cost. Their humanity in all its flawed beauty is what elevates the narrative from clever thriller to tragic meditation. And in that humanity, we see ourselves reflected, not in the specifics of the heist, but in the compromises, betrayals, and choices we all carry in our own lives. In the end, these characters are unforgettable not because of what they stole, but because of what they revealed. That endurance is not triumph, that betrayal is inevitable, and that even in the ruins of trust, fragments of loyalty and love still flicker. They remind us that stories of theft are always, in truth, stories of loss, and that the greatest heists are not measured in money or jewels, but in the pieces of ourselves we risk, and sometimes forfeit, along the way. Every film, no matter how polished its final cut appears on screen, carries with it a parallel narrative that unfolds far away from the gaze of the audience. It is the story of its own making, the accidents, the improvisations, the unlikely discoveries, and the hidden difficulties that shape a production into what it ultimately becomes. This one was no exception. If anything, the production behind this heist thriller was as unpredictable and precarious as the robbery at its center. The strangest facts of its creation, when pieced together, reveal that the real heist may have been less about breaking into vaults and more about stealing coherence from chaos. The first of these unusual facts dates back to the earliest days of pre-production. The script had been circulating for nearly a decade, whispered about in development circles as the cursed screenplay. Multiple directors had attempted to mount it, each abandoning it when financing fell apart or when stars dropped out. By the time it finally entered active production, it had become something of a legend, the kind of script young producers passed around late at night with hushed voices, marveling at its audacity. To finally see it greenlit felt like breaking a curse, though the curse was not done with them. Casting, as always, came with its own peculiarities. The lead role, which ultimately became inseparable from the actor who played it, was first offered to someone entirely different, an actor known for comedies, a performer whose name would have pulled the film toward irony rather than gravity. The director resisted fiercely, even threatening to walk if the studio forced the choice. What swayed them in the end was a screen test shot under bizarre circumstances. The actor who ultimately won the role happened to be in town, visiting a friend, and agreed to read a few lines in an abandoned warehouse with nothing but a handheld camera. The footage was grainy, the sound poor, but when the director watched it later, he said it was like seeing a man whose silence already carried the entire story. The strangeness of location scouting cannot be overstated. The production initially planned to film in a European city renowned for its architecture, believing it would lend authenticity to the heist of the century atmosphere. But logistical nightmares, permits denied, costs soaring, a local festival that threatened to close every street, forced them to look elsewhere at the last minute. They ended up filming in a city with almost the opposite reputation, a place not known for its glamour but for its grit. The irony was uncanny. The streets, lined with flickering neon signs and dampened by constant rain, gave the film exactly the tone it needed. It was a blessing disguised as failure, a reminder that art often thrives when plans collapse. Weather quickly became both adversary and collaborator. The director had wanted rain for atmosphere, believing that wet streets reflect neon better than any artificial setup could. What he didn't anticipate was that the city delivered too much rain. Entire nights of shooting were lost to torrential downpours that drowned equipment and left actors shivering through take after take. Yet when the footage was reviewed, the mistakes became miracles. One scene in particular, where the driver waits in the car while rain streaks the windshield, was not scripted to include weather at all. The rain distorted the lights outside into ghostly patterns, making the driver look trapped in a kaleidoscope of menace. It became one of the film's most iconic shots, born entirely of meteorological inconvenience. The cracked mirror scene is perhaps the most famous accident of the shoot, a story whispered almost reverently among crew members. The mirror was supposed to play a symbolic role, reflecting the protagonist's fractured self, but in the script it was meant to remain intact. On set under the heat of relentless lighting, the glass cracked mid-take. The actress flinched, startled by the sudden sound, and her expression, half horror, half despair, was real. The director immediately whispered to the cameraman to keep rolling. That unscripted moment, unplanned and unpolished, was later hailed by critics as one of the most brilliant symbols in the entire film. In truth, it was physics, not philosophy, that delivered it. Animals, too, found ways to intrude on the production. A stray dog became a recurring presence, slipping into night shoots as though it were part of the cast. Crew members tried again and again to keep it away, but it would return, curling up beside lights or following actors down alleys. At first, its presence infuriated the assistant director, who saw continuity nightmares looming, but the director insisted on keeping it, calling it a living metaphor. In the final cut, the dog appears several times, never explained, never acknowledged by characters. Viewers debated its meaning endlessly: loyalty, conscience, innocence wandering among corruption, without realizing the truth. It was a stubborn stray who refused to leave set catering unattended. Fireworks interrupted one particularly intense shoot. A group of teenagers, aware that filming was taking place in their neighborhood, decided to create chaos by setting off firecrackers just outside the perimeter. The explosions ruined audio and startled the actors mid-scene, sending tempers flaring. But when the footage was reviewed, the bursts of light in the background created an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos that suited the moment perfectly. Rather than cut around it, the director leaned in, weaving the fireworks into the scene as if they had always been intended. The teenagers had unknowingly donated one of the film's most striking visuals. Tension between actors shaped the production in ways as strange as any accident. The lead actress, meticulous in preparation, filled notebooks with character backstory and insisted on rehearsing every nuance. Her co-star, who played the strategist, loathed rehearsals, preferring to improvise and surprise others with his choices. Their methods clashed bitterly at first, with arguments breaking out on set. But the director encouraged the friction, believing their off-screen tension would lend authenticity to their on-screen mistrust. He was right. Their scenes crackled with energy, a blend of precision and unpredictability that critics later praised as electric chemistry. Behind the scenes, however, the two barely spoke between takes. Some of the strangest facts concern the way the film was financed. It had a surprisingly modest budget, especially for a heist thriller, and much of it was cobbled together from disparate sources. One investor pulled out at the last minute, forcing the crew to shoot an entire week with unpaid extras and volunteer assistance. Another portion of funding came from an art foundation that believed the film was a critique of capitalism, not realizing it was also meant to entertain. The irony of a story about theft being funded by institutions hoping for prestige was not lost on the crew, who joked that they were staging two heists simultaneously, one on screen and one in production offices. Sound design carried its own set of eccentricities. The composer refused to use traditional instruments, instead building much of the score from distorted recordings of city noise. He captured the buzz of faulty neon lights, the clatter of metal shutters, even the distorted hum of air conditioning units, and layered them into rhythms that felt both mechanical and alive. One particularly unsettling sound, which audiences described as the pulse of the city, was nothing more than the slowed-down recording of a malfunctioning fan. These choices, though bizarre, gave the soundtrack a texture unlike anything else, blurring the line between music and environment. Editing was another adventure in strangeness. The editor received hours of footage that defied continuity, cameras shaking, lighting inconsistent, stray figures wandering into frame. At first, it seemed unworkable. But the editor began to notice recurring accidents, the flicker of lamps, reflections in puddles, the dog's random appearances, and realized they could be stitched into motifs. Rather than hide the chaos, the edit emphasized it, creating patterns that made accidents look deliberate. What could have been a disaster became a haunting rhythm that defined the film's identity. The ending, too, was reshaped by strangeness. The scripted conclusion was far more definitive, with clear outcomes for each character. But during editing, the director stumbled on discarded test footage of the protagonist walking aimlessly through the city. It had been shot only to test lighting and lenses, never meant for the story. Yet there was something in the way the actor walked, exhausted, ambiguous, almost ghostly, that captured exactly the note the film needed to end on. The final sequence was rebuilt around these fragments, leaving the story unresolved, haunting, open to interpretation. Audiences assumed the ambiguity was intentional. In truth, it was a salvaged accident. Superstitions also grew around the production. Crew members whispered about the ghost lamp, a streetlight that flickered on and off unpredictably during night shoots, no matter how often electricians tried to fix it. Some joked it was cursed, others that it was a silent extra. The director, half amused and half unsettled, insisted on including it in multiple shots, framing it as a motif. Viewers later debated its symbolism endlessly, never realizing it was simply a faulty bulb. Even the crew's exhaustion became part of the film's DNA. Long nights of shooting stretched into dawn, meals eaten on curbs, laughter echoing against damp warehouse walls. Mistakes became running jokes. A cameraman once fell asleep while filming, the lens drooping until it captured only puddles reflecting neon. Instead of discarding it, the footage was woven into a montage. The accident became art. In many ways, the crew were living the same themes as the characters they filmed: survival, compromise, improvisation against impossible odds. Taken together, these strangest facts remind us that cinema is never only about control. It is about surrendering to chaos, about finding meaning in mistakes, about allowing accidents to shape beauty. The heist on screen was built from rehearsed plans collapsing into improvisation. The film itself was built in the same way. Every strange occurrence, the cracked mirror, the stubborn stray dog, the fireworks, the malfunctioning lamps, the chance test footage, became threads woven into the final fabric. And so the film carries two stories: the fictional tale of a daring robbery, and the real story of its own creation, where chaos directed as much as the director did. It is fitting, almost poetic, that a film about theft was itself stolen into existence, pieced together from accidents, betrayals, and moments of desperate endurance. The strangest facts are not trivia to amuse, but truths to remind us that art is never clean. It is messy, haunted, fragile, and it is precisely in that messiness, in those accidents, that it becomes unforgettable. The story of this heist film, on its surface, seems familiar. A crew assembles, a plan is drawn, tension mounts, and the great robbery unfolds in the darkness of a city already soaked in secrets. But when we step closer, when we examine each of its major events through a critical lens, the familiar reveals its strangeness. the genre reveals its cracks, and the film becomes less about theft and more about what it means to exist under systems that rob us every day. Each pivotal event is staged with precision, not to dazzle, but to expose the fragility of trust, the inevitability of betrayal, and the thin line between survival and collapse. What follows is a weaving together of these moments, a reflection not only on what happens in the story, but on why it matters, and how it reverberates long after the credits fade. The first significant event is deceptively small. The opening scene of the protagonist alone in his apartment. He is surrounded by clutter, unpaid bills, old photographs, scraps of blueprints sketched in restless hands. Nothing explodes here, no alarms blare. And yet, from a critical perspective, this is one of the film's most important statements. It situates the entire narrative not in spectacle, but in suffocation. The heist does not emerge from thrill-seeking or glamour, but from desperation, from the quiet violence of poverty. Critics were quick to note how this opening aligned the film with a literary tradition of tragedies, rooted not in kings and gods, but in ordinary lives buckling under invisible pressures. The cracked mirror in which he sees his face split into fragments reinforces this point. The self is already broken before the first lock is picked. The introduction of the crew is another event that demands close reading. On one level, it fulfills the expectations of the genre. We meet the driver, the strategist, the insider, each with their distinct skills, but the film refuses to reduce them to archetypes. The driver's haunted glances into the rearview mirror, the strategist's obsessive scribbles across maps, the insider's trembling hesitation, all these gestures complicate the roles. Rather than glorify them, the film situates their skills within trauma. From a critical viewpoint, this undermines the myth of the cool criminal and reframes them as fractured individuals who are not masters of their craft but prisoners of their pasts. The audience, used to slick montages of team assembly, instead encounters vulnerability. Critics praised this subversion, noting how it destabilized the genre's conventions and demanded empathy rather than admiration. The rehearsal scene, where the crew tests their timing in an abandoned warehouse, is another event rich with meaning. What is rehearsed here is not only the logistics of a heist, but the fragility of trust. When the insider falters, her hands trembling as she simulates unlocking a vault, silence falls over the group. The others' stares carry judgment and fear. From a structural perspective, this scene foreshadows the betrayals to come. From a thematic perspective, it shows how the heist is already unraveling before it begins. Scholars of cinema often point to such moments as pre-echoes, where future failures are contained in present gestures. What the rehearsal reveals is that the greatest threat is not alarms or guards but human uncertainty, the cracks within the crew itself. The first rehearsal bleeds into the first surveillance mission through the city, where the crew tests routes and timings. This event might appear procedural, but it offers one of the film's most striking critiques. The city itself becomes antagonist. Sirens slice the night without warning, police patrols appear from nowhere, and the rhythm of traffic bends the plan out of shape. The strategist's precise timings collapse under the weight of unpredictability. This scene, critics argued, demonstrated the futility of control in a chaotic system. The city is alive, indifferent, mocking their calculations. In its visual design, rain-slicking streets, neon reflecting in puddles, the film transforms the environment into a mirror of their inner chaos. The surveillance mission is less about preparation than about exposure, revealing that control is always an illusion. The opening of the vault, the moment around which the entire heist pivots, is staged with a quiet intensity that resists spectacle. The insider's trembling hands work the lock, the strategist hovers, the others hold their breath. And then the door yields, revealing treasure. From a critical perspective, what matters here is not the wealth itself but the unease with which it is received. Instead of triumph, silence fills the room. The protagonist insists on taking only what was planned, but greed and temptation pull at the others. Critics noted how this moment critiqued not only the characters, but the audience's expectations. In most heist films, the vault's opening is climax catharsis. Here it is hollow, uneasy, poisoned by doubt. The vault becomes less a prize than a test, when the crew is already failing. The betrayal that follows, the realization that silence is the true alarm, marks one of the story's sharpest turns. Security forces appear not as surprised intruders, but as figures who have been waiting all along. The insider's divided loyalties surface here, her earlier hesitation recontextualized as foreshadowing of her compromise. From a critical perspective, this event reframes betrayal not as dramatic twist, but as inevitability. In systems of survival, betrayal is baked in. The insider is neither villain nor hero, but a figure crushed by competing necessities. Critics were divided on her portrayal, some praising the nuance of her desperation, others condemning the film for leaving her arc unresolved. But all agreed that this betrayal shifted the story from heist fantasy into existential tragedy. The death of the peripheral crew member during the chaotic escape carries symbolic weight disproportionate to his role. He is not the protagonist, nor even deeply developed, yet his fall reverberates. It reminds the audience that the cost of such endeavors is not abstract but flesh. From a structural perspective, his death anchors the escape in grief, preventing it from becoming spectacle. From a thematic perspective, it signals that survival will never be whole. The crew leaves behind more than just wealth. They leave behind pieces of themselves. Critics noted how this choice resisted genre expectations, stripping the glamour from violence and replacing it with mourning. The getaway itself, with the driver weaving through alleys under sirens and headlights, is another event ripe for analysis. The sequence is filmed with shaky handheld cameras, disorienting angles and reflections blurring through rain-streaked glass. The effect is claustrophobic, suffocating, refusing the audience the clean satisfaction of a chase. From a critical lens, this choice underscores the theme of futility. The crew may be ahead, but they are never free. The city closes around them, the environment itself complicit in their entrapment. Critics praised the visceral immediacy of this sequence, noting how it transformed a familiar trope into an experience of panic and inevitability. Perhaps the most significant betrayal is not the insiders but the strategist's. His decision to fracture the crew, to abandon them with part of the haul, transforms him from figure of control into embodiment of paranoia. From a critical perspective, this event crystallizes the theme of obsession. His brilliance, his maps and timings, were never tools of mastery, but shields against his own fear. When the system collapses, he collapses with it, revealing that control was always illusion. His betrayal is not motivated by greed alone, but by terror, by his inability to endure uncertainty. Critics found in this moment a devastating critique of rationalism itself, of the belief that logic can conquer chaos. The dock sequence where the crew expects escape but finds emptiness functions as the story's climax and ultimate critique. The boat is gone, whether stolen, seized, or never real, we do not know. This ambiguity is deliberate. The dock, empty and silent, becomes the symbol of futility. All plans, all risks, all sacrifices lead here to nothing. From a structural perspective, this is the collapse of the heist genre itself, denying the audience resolution. From a thematic perspective, it embodies the film's philosophy. Survival offers no triumph, only endurance. Critics called this one of the most haunting conclusions in the genre, a rejection of closure that forces the audience to sit with ambiguity. The protagonist's final act, remaining behind while others flee, has been interpreted in many ways. Some see it as sacrifice, others as surrender, still others as inevitability. From a critical viewpoint, it encapsulates his entire arc. From the beginning, he carried silence like a burden, a refusal to hope. His decision to stay is not heroism but consistency. He has always been the anchor, the one who absorbs weight. His absence in the final scenes becomes presence, haunting the survivors. Critics praised this ambiguity, noting how it refused to sanctify him while still elevating his endurance into something mythic. The resolution, fragmented among the survivors, deepens the film's resonance. The driver, loyal despite fear, sits in his car, rain streaking the windshield, his hands still gripping the wheel as though unable to release the night. The insider, torn by betrayal and survival, walks through empty streets, her face marked by sorrow. The strategist's fate remains uncertain, his greed and paranoia perhaps his undoing. These fragmented images refuse closure, reminding us that the heist was never about wealth but about loss. Critics admired the restraint, the refusal to indulge in epilogues or explanations. The ambiguity invited reflection, forcing audiences to carry the weight of what was unresolved. Taken together, these events form more than a story, they form a meditation. Each moment, when examined critically, resists genre conventions and insists on ambiguity. The opening situates the heist in suffocation. The assembly humanizes archetypes. The rehearsal foreshadows collapse. The vault critiques triumph. The betrayals expose inevitability. The death anchors violence in grief. The chase embodies futility. The dock delivers emptiness. The protagonist's silence becomes sacrifice. The resolution fragments into ambiguity. The film's impact lies in this refusal to comfort. Critics hailed it as a bold reimagining of the heist genre, one that stripped away glamour to reveal fragility. Audiences were divided, some frustrated by its bleakness, others haunted by its honesty, but both reactions testify to its resonance. The film does not allow us to leave unchanged. It lingers, echoing like the silence that begins and ends it. What these events teach us, finally, is that theft is not only about vaults and jewels. It is about time stolen by poverty, trust stolen by betrayal, certainty stolen by chaos. The film becomes less about crime than about existence, less about spectacle than about endurance. And that is why when the credits roll, we find ourselves not applauding but reflecting, carrying the weight of ambiguity like a shadow. It is not resolution the film offers, but recognition, that in our own lives too we plan, we gamble, we betray, we endure. And like the characters we watched, we discover that survival itself, fragile and incomplete, may be the only victory we are granted. From the moment the project began its long and uneven journey toward the screen, it carried with it the atmosphere of something fated to be both cursed and charmed at the same time. The making of this heist story was not a clean, linear march from idea to finished product, but a jagged path of accidents, compromises, bursts of brilliance, and sheer stubbornness. To explore its production is to step into another story altogether, one that mirrors the chaos of the plot itself. A crew of filmmakers trying to steal coherence out of circumstance, improvising against forces larger than themselves, and discovering, again and again, that the strangest accidents often give birth to the most lasting images. The script had its own mythology before cameras ever rolled. For years it was passed around in quiet corners of production offices, gaining a reputation as the impossible film. Several directors had signed on and then backed out, sometimes within weeks. Stars were attached, then walked away. Financiers lost interest, sometimes overnight. Rumor had it that one early attempt even fell apart the day before shooting was to begin, when a primary investor suddenly declared bankruptcy. By the time the eventual director picked it up, the script had acquired the aura of a cursed text. But he saw something different. Where others saw danger, he saw inevitability. It already reads like a survival story, he told the crew at the very first table read, so we will make it that way. If we can survive the making of it, we will already be living the story. Casting unfolded like a game of chance. The role of the protagonist was originally intended for an actor known for comedy, a studio suggestion intended to make the film more marketable. The director balked, refusing to turn the story into irony. A heated standoff followed, during which the studio nearly pulled financing. The turning point came in the form of a bizarre coincidence. The actor who eventually played the role happened to be in the same city, visiting a friend, when the director arranged an impromptu screen test in an abandoned warehouse. Shot on a handheld camera with terrible lighting, the footage should have been useless. But when the director reviewed it later, he described it as watching a man whose silence could tell a story louder than words. That shaky recording became the audition tape that saved the film. Even stranger were the difficulties of location scouting. The initial plan was to film in a polished European capital, a city whose architecture could lend grandeur to the heist. Yet at the last minute, permits were denied, hotel strikes shut down accommodations, and the cost of staging night shoots skyrocketed. Within days, the entire production was forced to relocate. They landed instead in a grittier, rain-drenched city not known for its cinematic beauty, but the director embraced it. "This is the city we deserve," he said, "one that looks like it's been robbed already." The locations they found, the neon-choked streets, the narrow alleys, the damp warehouses, became central to the film's atmosphere. What looked like failure became one of their greatest strokes of fortune. Rain, however, proved to be both blessing and curse. The director loved it, believing wet streets gave the camera a depth that artificial lighting could never replicate, but the city delivered rain in torrents. Night after night, the cast and crew found themselves soaked, their equipment sputtering, their schedules collapsing under weather that refused to cooperate. At one point, the cinematographer joked that the real lead of the film was water. Yet when dailies were reviewed, the accidental distortions of rain on glass created ghostly patterns that could never have been designed. One of the most iconic shots of the driver waiting in the car, his face blurred behind rivulets of water, was entirely unplanned. The weather had ruined the original setup, but gifted something infinitely better. Accidents, in fact, became a recurring motif in the production. The now famous cracked mirror scene was born not from script or design but from physics. The heat of set lights fractured the glass mid-take, startling the actress into a gasp that was pure and unrehearsed. The director whispered to the cameraman to keep rolling. That moment of shock became one of the film's central images, hailed later as a brilliant metaphor for fractured identity. In truth, it was an accident they could never have recreated. "That mirror was the best actor we had," one crew member later joked. Animals also insisted on joining the story. A stray dog wandered onto set during a night shoot and refused to leave. The assistant director chased it off repeatedly, but it returned, curling up near lights or trailing actors as if part of the cast. Rather than fight it, the director decided to embrace its presence, filming it as though it belonged. In the final cut, the dog appears in several key moments, unacknowledged by characters but impossible to miss. Audiences have debated its symbolism endlessly. Was it loyalty, conscience, or fate itself? The truth is simpler. It was just a stubborn stray who liked the catering table. Yet its inclusion deepened the film's mythology, proof that accidents can become icons. Even local residents became part of the production's lore. During one late-night shoot, a group of teenagers decided to cause chaos by setting off fireworks just outside the perimeter. The explosions ruined audio and startled the actors mid-scene, sending tempers flaring. Yet the footage, when reviewed, looked electric. The bursts of light in the background lent the sequence a raw, uncontrolled energy. The director chose to keep it, turning what could have been disaster into cinematic texture. Those teenagers, unaware, had donated one of the most unforgettable visuals of the film. Not all chaos was welcome. Tensions ran high between cast members whose methods clashed spectacularly. The lead actress prepared meticulously, filling notebooks with backstory and rehearsing every nuance. Her co-star, who played the strategist, loathed rehearsals, preferring to improvise and disrupt. Their friction bled into arguments, sometimes halting production entirely. But the director allowed it to simmer, convinced their off-screen animosity fueled their on-screen mistrust. He was right. Their scenes together crackled with an energy that no amount of planning could have created. Still, by the end of production, the two barely spoke outside their lines, each carrying grudges as sharp as their characters. The budget, surprisingly modest for such an ambitious story, forced constant improvisation. Sets intended to be constructed on soundstages had to be found in the real world instead. Extras were often unpaid locals. Some scenes were lit using equipment borrowed from nearby shops. At one point, when a generator failed, the crew lit an entire scene using only the glow of actual neon signs. That footage, far from looking cheap, became some of the most atmospheric in the film. The irony was not lost on them. A story about theft was being made by stealing fragments of reality. The sound team faced their own nightmares. Filming in live environments meant capturing uncontrollable noise. Cars honking, dogs barking, music leaking from apartments. The director refused to block or control it, insisting that the chaos was part of the city's voice. The sound engineers grumbled endlessly, but when post-production arrived, those layers of accidental noise created a soundscape of remarkable depth. The composer leaned into this, crafting a score built not from traditional instruments but from distorted recordings of the city itself. The hum of neon became bass notes, the hiss of rain became percussion, the metallic clang of shutters became rhythm. The result was a soundscape that critics described as the city singing its own menace. Editing the film was another act of theft, stealing coherence from chaos. The editor received hours of footage with inconsistent lighting, shaky cameras, even moments where crew members accidentally entered the frame. At first it seemed unusable, but as the editor sifted through the fragments, patterns emerged. The flicker of lamps, the recurring puddle reflections, the stubborn dog, all these accidents became motifs. The editor leaned into them, stitching chaos into rhythm, until the film carried a haunting consistency born not of design but of surrender. It felt less like editing, the editor said later, and more like discovering a film that was hiding inside the mistakes. Perhaps the strangest fact of all is how the ending was born. The script originally concluded with clear resolution, tying up each character's fate. But the director, dissatisfied, stumbled upon discarded test footage of the protagonist walking alone through city streets, shot only to test lenses. Something about his posture, the exhaustion in his steps, the ambiguity in his face, captured the truth the story needed. The ending was rewritten around those fragments, leaving the narrative unresolved, haunting, open to interpretation. Audiences assumed it was carefully planned. In reality, it was an accident rescued from the cutting room floor. The crew developed superstitions as the weeks wore on. They spoke of the ghost lamp, a streetlight that flickered unpredictably during multiple shoots, no matter how often electricians fixed it. They joked that it was the spirit of the film, guiding them through chaos. Others remembered the cameraman who fell asleep mid-shot, his lens drifting to capture only puddles reflecting neon. That footage was later spliced into a montage, another accident transformed into art. Meals eaten on curbs, laughter echoing against damp walls, exhaustion collapsing into delirious humor. All these small human moments defined the production as much as the film itself. The crew often remarked that they felt less like workers and more like participants in their own heist. improvising against collapsing schedules, stealing images from chance. By the time filming ended, they were bonded not by success but by survival. What lingers from these insights is the recognition that the film was never crafted in neat precision. It was born of compromise, accident, improvisation. Every strange occurrence, the cracked mirror, the stray dog, the fireworks, the ghost lamp, became not obstacle but material. The film itself is a heist, a theft of meaning from chaos, a survival of artistry against impossible odds. And that perhaps is the greatest fun fact of all, that the making of the film mirrors its own narrative. Just as the characters planned carefully only to be undone by accidents and betrayals, so too did the crew. And just as the characters discovered that survival itself was the only true victory, so too did the filmmakers. They survived the storm of accidents, and in doing so, created a story that now feels inevitable, as though it could only ever have been born this way. The first impression the film gives us has little to do with dialogue or character, and everything to do with space. Long before a word is spoken, the city itself begins to speak, and it speaks in a voice that is both seductive and suffocating. Its skyline cuts sharp against the night, all glass and steel, but the camera doesn't linger there. Instead, it drifts down into the underbelly, into alleys slick with rain, into storefronts bathed in flickering neon, into shadows where voices echo without bodies. This is the heartbeat of the film, the setting as living presence, shaping mood and tone, pressing down on the characters until they cannot breathe without acknowledging its weight. The story begins in the protagonist's apartment, a small and weary space that feels less like a home and more like a cell. The walls are stained, the furniture sparse, and the lighting dim, filtering in through blinds that never quite open enough to let the day inside. The cinematography insists on framing him against clutter, unpaid bills scattered across the table, empty bottles stacked in corners, old photographs curling at the edges. The space swallows him, shrinking his body until he seems to be dissolving into its walls. This apartment is not incidental. It is an extension of his psychology, the visual manifestation of fatigue and inevitability. From the very first frame, the film makes its point. Survival begins not in grand decisions, but in suffocating environments that shape us long before we act. The transition from this private suffocation into the public chaos of the city is one of the film's most striking choices. The city here is not presented as opportunity or glamour, but as menace, alive with contradictions. Its streets pulse with noise, vendors shouting, cars honking, stray dogs barking, the buzz of neon that flickers and hums like broken machinery. The cinematographer leans into contrast, flooding the streets with garish color while pushing alleys into such deep shadow that the eye strains to follow. The effect is disorienting, a reminder that the city itself is a labyrinth designed to overwhelm. Characters do not simply move through it, they are swallowed by it, their bodies often framed small against towering buildings, or lost in crowds that flow around them like indifferent tides. Critics were quick to note how the city was less backdrop than antagonist, its very design conspiring against the possibility of escape. One of the most memorable settings is the rain-slick street, where the protagonist first encounters the collectors. The atmosphere here is crafted with meticulous care. Rain falls in thin sheets, turning the pavement into a mirror that doubles every neon sign into warped reflection. The collectors emerge not with blaring music or sudden cuts but with quiet menace, their faces half-lit, their calm words clashing with the violence implied beneath. The camera lingers not on their threats but on the setting itself, the reflections that distort their features, the rain that drowns their voices, the way the street seems to close in around them. This is not simply a meeting. It is an initiation into inevitability, and the environment delivers that truth more powerfully than the dialogue. The marketplace sequence offers a starkly different setting, yet carries the same sense of menace. Here the city bursts with motion and sound. Stalls overflow with goods, people press shoulder to shoulder, and colors saturate the frame in dizzying vibrancy. Yet the protagonist does not belong here. The camera follows her in handheld style, weaving unsteadily through the crowd, forcing us to share her disorientation. The noise overwhelms, the bodies jostle, the lights dazzle until they become oppressive. The market, in theory a space of life and abundance, becomes instead a symbol of indifference. The city's chaos is not romantic, it is suffocating, a reminder that even in places bursting with vitality, survival is lonely. The intrusion of the apartment later in the story transforms that private space into something sinister. When she returns to find the door ajar, the cinematography resists cliché. There is no sudden cut, no dramatic sting of music. Instead, the camera lingers on small details. A cup moved from its place, a drawer left open, the sound of silence so heavy it feels like a weight pressing into the chest. the absence of violence becomes more terrifying than its presence. The apartment, once suffocating but private, becomes violated, no longer a sanctuary but another battlefield. This choice reveals the film's larger philosophy. Horror is not always in explosions or blood, but in absence, in the way familiar spaces become uncanny. The warehouse scene offers another shift in tone. Here the setting is vast, cavernous, echoing with the sound of dripping water and the hum of fluorescent lights. The space dwarfs the characters, framing them as small figures swallowed by shadows. The harsh white lighting strips away glamour, illuminating every imperfection, every scar, every tremor of fear. Violence here is not staged as spectacle, but as sterile business, the warehouse itself a reminder that cruelty can be industrial, mechanical, detached. The cinematography emphasizes distance, long shots that reduce characters to specks in an indifferent environment. Critics later described this as the film's most honest scene, where the heist genre's glamour was dismantled into bleak realism. The cracked mirror sequence is perhaps the film's most iconic use of setting as symbol. A simple mirror, fractured under the heat of lights, becomes an image that defines the protagonist's arc. The cinematography lingers on her reflection, her face split into shards, shadows seeping into cracks that turn the reflection monstrous. Here the setting is not grand or elaborate, it is ordinary, domestic. Yet in its fracture, it externalizes the psychology of the character, turning inner collapse into visible reality. Audiences remembered this image long after the plot faded, proof that the simplest props, when framed with precision, can become symbols of devastating resonance. The climax unfolds in a narrow alley, and the choice of this setting is crucial. Rather than stage the confrontation in a dramatic rooftop or an abandoned factory, the film chooses claustrophobia. The alley walls lean inward, oppressive, their graffiti and grime pressing against the characters as they fight not only enemies but the space itself. The lighting is minimal, street lamps flickering unpredictably, plunging sections of the alley into sudden darkness. The camera angles tilt, unsteady, amplifying the imbalance. This is not choreography, it is survival, messy and desperate. The setting reinforces this truth, refusing grandeur, insisting on suffocation. The city at night becomes its own character. Neon lights never glow steadily. They flicker, stutter, buzz, creating instability in every frame. Streets reflect distorted fragments of faces and buildings in puddles, doubling and warping reality, until nothing feels certain. The cinematographer frames the protagonist often against these reflections, her identity fractured into pieces that cannot be reconciled. Critics compared these choices to expressionist cinema, where environments mirror inner psychology. Here, the city itself becomes a mirror, reflecting the protagonist's disintegration, reminding us that space is never neutral. The sound design intertwines seamlessly with the visual world to enhance the atmosphere. In the apartment, silence dominates, broken only by mundane sounds amplified into menace. The hum of a refrigerator, the drip of a faucet, the scrape of a chair. In the city, noise overwhelms. Horns, voices, barking dogs, buzzing neon, a constant backdrop of chaos. During chase sequences, sound distorts, footsteps echo unnaturally, breaths grow louder, as if the city itself is breathing down her neck. The soundscape, like the setting, insists on participation. The audience does not watch, they inhabit the same hostile world. Color plays its own role in shaping mood and tone. The palette shifts with the story's descent. The apartment is muted, drained of vibrancy, painted in dull browns and pale grays that mirror fatigue. The city bursts with color but never warmth. The neon is acid green, lurid purple, sickly yellow. The warehouse strips color away altogether, leaving only sterile white. And in the ending, when the protagonist walks aimlessly through streets that look unchanged yet feel altered, the colors blur together, reflections distorting until reality itself feels unstable. Each palette is chosen not for realism, but for resonance, mirroring her arc from exhaustion to disorientation to fragmentation. Camera movement, too, becomes part of the language. Early scenes rely on static frames, trapping the protagonist in her apartment's suffocating geometry. As the story deepens, handheld shots dominate, the camera weaving through markets and alleys as if struggling to keep pace. In moments of confrontation, the camera stumbles, shakes, loses focus, creating immediacy that resists polish. By the climax, the camera plunges erratically into shadows, refusing clarity, immersing the audience in instability. Critics noted how this technique transformed the viewing experience from observation into complicity, making the audience feel as trapped as the characters. The music carried its own share of eccentricities. The composer refused traditional scoring, instead recording city noises, buzzing neon, clanging shutters, humming fans, and distorting them into rhythm. The resulting soundtrack blurred the line between environment and score, making the city itself seem to sing. Critics called it hypnotic, a soundscape that refused to comfort but lingered in memory like the hum of electricity. Superstitions grew as the shoot dragged on. Crew members whispered about curses, about the script's long history of failed productions. When accidents piled up, the cracked mirror, the drifting boat, the malfunctioning lamp, they joked that the film was haunted. But rather than demoralize them, the superstition bonded them. Each new mishap was greeted with laughter and the refrain, "The curse feeds us." By the time filming wrapped, the curse had become legend, a reminder that survival was its own form of triumph. Perhaps the most moving behind-the-scenes story is also the simplest. On the final night after weeks of exhaustion, the crew gathered in a circle around the last set. They were soaked, bruised, and weary beyond measure. The director, usually terse, spoke softly. "We didn't make the film we planned. We made the film that survived." There was silence, then applause, not for spectacle but for endurance. That moment, though never recorded, was the true ending, the recognition that the greatest heist they had pulled off was not on screen but in life, stealing coherence out of chaos, meaning out of accident. What emerges from these stories is a portrait of filmmaking as survival, as improvisation, as accident turned into art. The cracked mirror, the stray dog, the drifting boat, the ghost lamp, all became part of the story not because they were planned, but because they refused to be ignored. The interactions among cast and crew, tense, hilarious, exhausting, tender, shaped performances in ways no rehearsal ever could. The challenges they faced, budget cuts, weather, exhaustion, were not obstacles but the very material of the film's atmosphere. In the end, the greatest insight is this: the making of the film mirrored its own narrative. Just as the characters rehearsed plans only to be undone by betrayal and chaos, so too did the crew. Just as the characters discovered that survival itself was the only true victory, so too did the filmmakers. They endured the storms, the accidents, the failures, and in doing so, created a work that feels alive in every frame. The behind-the-scenes story, then, is not separate from the film. It is the film, refracted through reality. And that, perhaps, is why it resonates so deeply, because it was not crafted out of control, but stolen from chaos, just like the heist at its heart. Themes are never just decorations in a story like this. They are the pulse beneath the action, the invisible architecture that holds every scene together. The heist itself, as thrilling as it appears on the surface, is only the vessel through which the deeper truths move. And so to understand this film, one must sink below the mechanics of locked vaults and racing cars and listen to the quieter voices, the recurring symbols, the motifs hidden in reflections, the silences that stretch longer than dialogue, the shadows that say more than explosions ever could. What we find there is not a tale of criminals chasing wealth, but a meditation on inevitability, betrayal, survival, and the haunting persistence of ambiguity. The most insistent theme woven throughout is inevitability. From the very first frame, inevitability presses in, suffocating the characters before they ever set foot in the vault. The protagonist's apartment, dimly lit, cluttered with bills and photographs, is already a cage. His silence, his fatigue, his restless sketches of blueprints all point to a truth that the heist has already begun long before the first lock is picked. This inevitability is not the mythic fate of tragedies, but the crushing machinery of poverty, debt, and time. The cinematography reinforces it, trapping characters in frames where the environment looms larger than they do. Critics who saw the film early noted that inevitability was its central philosophy. The recognition that the most dangerous traps are not sprung suddenly, but built quietly into daily life until there is no choice but to leap into risk. Closely tied to inevitability is compromise, the second great theme. Every character is defined not by what they desire, but by what they give up. The insider, drawn into the plan by desperation, embodies this most painfully. Her every hesitation, her trembling hands, her furtive glances toward cameras remind us that her choice was never free. She does not join the crew out of loyalty or greed, but out of survival, forced to compromise integrity for the sake of her family. The strategist, haunted by a past failure, compromises truth for illusion, convincing himself that precision can undo guilt. The driver compromises freedom for loyalty, staying when instinct tells him to flee. And the protagonist himself compromises his humanity, burying grief and fear in silence until sacrifice consumes him. The theme of compromise seeps into every corner, reminding us that survival is never clean, that every step forward carries the stain of what was lost. Betrayal, of course, emerges as the connective tissue binding the story. But what makes betrayal here powerful is its omnipresence. It is not limited to the insider's divided loyalties or the strategist's abandonment. Betrayal is systemic. The city itself betrays those who live within it, promising possibility while delivering suffocation. Institutions betray trust, protecting wealth while crushing the poor. Even the body betrays the characters. Hands tremble, eyes flicker, fatigue overwhelms. The cracked mirror becomes the most potent symbol of betrayal, the self fractured into shards, no longer whole, no longer trustworthy. Critics later described betrayal in the film as inevitable as gravity, a force so pervasive it could not be escaped. And yet, betrayal is not delivered with melodrama. It is quiet, almost tender, slipping in through silence, absence, hesitation. Disillusionment flows naturally from betrayal, the slow erosion of hope until nothing remains but endurance. The neon lights that bathe the city symbolize this perfectly. At first dazzling, their glow becomes sickly, their flickering an irritant, their colors less vibrant than poisonous. Neon, once the emblem of modern promise, becomes a metaphor for hollow illusions. The protagonist looks at it not with awe but with exhaustion, his face distorted in reflections across puddles. Every character carries a fragment of disillusionment. The strategist's collapse when precision fails, the driver's recognition that loyalty does not guarantee safety, the insider's despair at realizing survival still costs too much. In the end, disillusionment is not a single event but a gradual decay, a theme that lingers like rust corroding steel. Silence itself becomes a theme, carrying as much weight as dialogue. The protagonist rarely speaks, yet his silence is not emptiness but resistance. In a world where words can betray, silence becomes his shield. The cinematography leans into this, lingering on his face while noise swirls around him. Radios fail, conversations drown in traffic, alarms refuse to sound even when danger arrives, communication itself collapses. Silence is both prison and protection, a reminder that truth is fragile, easily weaponized. Critics noted how the film echoed traditions of absurdist literature, where silence speaks louder than language, where meaning is found not in clarity, but in the refusal to articulate. Absurdity weaves through the narrative in quieter ways, surfacing in moments that unsettle more than they amuse. A weapon misfires at the worst possible time. A neon sign flickers so erratically, it seems to mock the character's desperation. Rain falls at the most inconvenient moments, drowning plans as though nature itself conspires against them. The stray dog, wandering in and out of scenes without explanation, embodies this absurdity most clearly. Some interpret it as conscience, others as loyalty, still others as meaningless intrusion. Its persistence defies explanation, reminding us that life itself often resists order. Critics later argued that the absurdist undercurrents gave the film its distinctive tone, not pure tragedy, but tragedy tinged with futility, as though the universe were laughing quietly in the background. Control and its futility is another defining theme. The strategist, with his maps and timings, represents the human need to master chaos through precision, yet his collapse exposes the truth: control is illusion. Radios fail, cars stall, alarms refuse to behave as expected. Even the city resists choreography, its rhythms indifferent to human planning. The dock sequence, where the crew arrives to find the escape boat gone, crystallizes this theme. All control dissolves into emptiness. The boat, meant to symbolize salvation, becomes absence. Critics praised this as one of the boldest choices of the film, a direct rejection of genre conventions that usually reward planning with escape. Here, futility reigns. Connection, fragile yet persistent, provides the film's only tenderness. Amid betrayal and compromise, moments of human intimacy flicker like firelight in darkness. The protagonist's quiet exchanges with his mother, though strained, are rooted in love. The driver's loyalty, though born of fear, is still loyalty. Even the insider, despite her betrayal, chooses not to abandon entirely, lingering as though seeking redemption. These connections, fragile and fleeting, remind us that humanity persists even in ruin. Symbolically, firelight embodies this theme, small, warm, yet vulnerable to the suffocating night. The firelight sequences, dim and brief, are some of the most moving in the film, insisting that even in despair, tenderness refuses to die. Ambiguity becomes the final theme, crowning the narrative. The ending offers no resolution, no clear fate for the protagonist, no definitive answers for the survivors. The dock's emptiness, the protagonist's absence, the survivors' fractured futures, all remain unresolved. This ambiguity is not laziness but philosophy. Life does not resolve neatly, stories should not either. The cinematography reinforces this by blurring the final images, pulling the camera back until the protagonist becomes a speck in a city that looks unchanged, yet feels irrevocably altered. Critics admired this refusal of closure, calling it faithful to traditions of existential literature, where meaning lies not in answers but in haunting questions. Audiences, though divided, admitted the ambiguity lingered long after the film ended, forcing reflection rather than offering comfort. Symbols breathe life into these themes, weaving them into tangible form. The cracked mirror, as mentioned, embodies fractured identity, betrayal of the self, inevitability of collapse. Neon lights symbolize disillusionment, hollow promises that dazzle only to corrode. Rain symbolizes inevitability, falling regardless of human desire, washing away plans as indifferently as time erases effort. The stray dog embodies absurdity, persistence, perhaps even loyalty, resisting explanation. Firelight embodies connection, fragile defiance against suffocating darkness. The dock, empty and silent, symbolizes futility, the betrayal of salvation itself. Each symbol recurs with rhythm, reinforcing the themes until they feel inescapable, etched into the viewer's psyche. What connects all of these themes and symbols is their relationship to the characters. The protagonist's silence embodies inevitability and ambiguity. The driver's loyalty embodies fragile connection and fear. The strategist's obsession embodies control's futility and disillusionment. The insider's hesitation embodies compromise and betrayal. Each character is not simply an individual, but a vessel through which the themes move. Their arcs mirror the symbols around them, their choices echoing the environment that swallows them. Critics pointed out that the film was less a story about people and more a story about ideas embodied in flesh, a cinematic parable of existence. The emotional resonance of these themes cannot be overstated. Audiences may not articulate inevitability or ambiguity in abstract terms, but they feel it in their bones. They recognize the exhaustion of compromise, the sting of betrayal, the corrosion of disillusionment. They laugh uneasily at absurdity, despair at futility, cling to fragile connections. The film does not entertain by providing spectacle, but by forcing recognition. It insists that these themes are not confined to the screen, but lived by every viewer in their own ways. That recognition is what haunts long after the credits fade. In the end, the film's themes and symbols transform it from a heist thriller into a meditation on existence. Inevitability presses down, compromise corrodes, betrayal fractures, disillusionment erodes, silence shields, absurdity mocks, control collapses, connection flickers, ambiguity endures. The cracked mirror, the flickering neon, the rain, the stray dog, the firelight, the empty dock, all these symbols breathe these truths into life. The plot may follow a robbery, but the story follows humanity itself, stumbling through betrayal, clinging to tenderness, enduring ambiguity. That is why when audiences and critics look back on this film, they remember less the mechanics of the heist than the weight of its atmosphere, the sting of its symbols, the persistence of its themes. It was never about what was stolen in a vault. It was about what life steals from us, about what survival demands we surrender, about how even in fracture and futility, human beings endure. The night always comes, the vault is always locked, the boat is always gone, but still we reach, still we conspire, still we endure. And in that endurance, fragile and imperfect, we find the film's most haunting truth. Survival itself is defiance, ambiguity itself is meaning. Every story eventually demands an ending, though some resist the neatness of closure with every fiber of their being. This film belongs to that latter category, refusing to wrap itself into comforting answers, or to offer audiences the relief of triumph or tragedy as final destination. And so it feels fitting that as we reach the end of this exploration together, what lingers is not certainty, but weight. The accumulation of atmospheres, symbols, betrayals, and silences that press on the mind like the rain that pressed on every street the characters walked. The conclusion here, both in the film and in our journey through it, is less about tying loose ends than about stepping back to see the fractured mosaic we've been staring at piece by piece. Only then do we recognize the shape it has formed, even if the edges remain jagged and incomplete. From the beginning, inevitability guided the story's pulse. We began in a cramped apartment where the protagonist was already suffocating, a space heavy with bills and memories that weighed more than furniture. That first setting told us what words did not. The heist had already begun, not in a vault but in the quiet accumulation of debts and disappointments. The city, with its flickering neon and rain-slicked streets, echoed this inevitability. No amount of planning could outmaneuver the truth that survival itself had been stolen long before the characters made their move. Inevitability was not simply theme. It was atmosphere, seeping into every shot, whispering that outcomes were already written even as characters fought to resist them. From inevitability flowed compromise, each character forced to surrender pieces of themselves for the sake of survival. The insider, trembling at locks, compromising integrity for her family. The strategist, obsessively revising maps, compromising reality for illusion. The driver, gripping the wheel too tightly, compromising freedom for loyalty, and the protagonist himself carrying silence like a shield, compromising humanity for sacrifice. These compromises shaped the story more than any blueprint of the heist. They reminded us that survival never comes clean, that what looks like triumph often conceals quiet surrender. Betrayal became the story's most insistent refrain, cutting through trust like barbed wire. The insider's divided loyalties surfaced at the vault, the strategist's paranoia fractured the crew mid-flight, and even the city betrayed them, collapsing their rehearsed timings with the chaos of traffic, patrols, and noise. Yet betrayal was not delivered with melodramatic flourish. It seeped quietly through hesitation, omission, silence. The cracked mirror symbolized this perfectly, the self betrayed by its own fracture, the reflection no longer whole. In betrayal, the story found not just tension but truth, that in systems of survival, trust is fragile, always vulnerable to fracture. Disillusionment followed naturally, corroding hope until it became rust. Neon, once dazzling, turned sickly. Markets, overflowing with life, became suffocating. Escape routes collapsed into dead ends. Each symbol, the flickering lamp, the broken glass, the empty dock, reminded us that promises fail, that illusions corrode, that salvation dissolves into absence. Disillusionment was not revealed in grand gestures but in gradual erosion, like paint peeling from walls, leaving behind the bare surface of despair. Absurdity haunted the margins, mocking with its contradictions. A stray dog wandered into frame, persistent and unexplained, interpreted endlessly by audiences but in truth born of accident. Fireworks exploded during a chase, not scripted but embraced, turning chaos into atmosphere. Rain fell at the most inconvenient times, drowning microphones but gifting unforgettable reflections. These absurd intrusions mirrored life itself, which so often resists order and reason. Critics later argued that the absurdity gave the story its distinctive tone, tragedy tinged with futility, despair haunted by irony. Control, or rather its futility, defined the strategist's arc. His maps and diagrams, his obsession with timing, represented humanity's need to master chaos. Yet radios failed, cars stalled, alarms refused to cooperate, and the city itself swallowed precision. The dock sequence crystallized this futility. The boat gone, the plan dissolved, control revealed as illusion. What remained was only endurance, stripped of triumph, naked in its fragility. Connection flickered briefly, fragile as firelight. The driver's loyalty, the insider's lingering remorse, the protagonist's quiet tenderness toward his family, these small acts of intimacy glowed against the suffocating dark. They reminded us that even amid betrayal and inevitability, humanity persists in brief, fragile sparks. The firelight sequences, dim and tender, embodied this truth. Connection is not salvation but defiance, a refusal to let despair extinguish all warmth. Ambiguity crowned the story, refusing resolution. The protagonist's fate remained uncertain, his absence more powerful than presence. The survivors lingered in fragmented futures, haunted but unresolved. The city looked unchanged, yet everything felt altered. This ambiguity was not accident but philosophy, a recognition that life does not resolve neatly, that survival carries weight without clarity. Critics praised the ending's refusal of closure, calling it haunting, existential, true. Audiences debated, resisted, remembered. The ambiguity lingered like silence after a question never answered. Symbolism wove these themes into tangible images. The cracked mirror fractured identity. Neon lights poisoned promise. Rain symbolized inevitability. The stray dog embodied absurdity. Firelight represented fragile connection. The empty dock revealed futility. Each symbol recurred, embedding themes into memory, ensuring they lingered not as abstract ideas, but as images burned into the mind. The cinematography reinforced this, framing characters against reflections, shadows, and distortions, turning environment into psychology. Sound, too, became symbolic, silence speaking louder than dialogue, city noise overwhelming, until it felt alive, score blurred into hums and hisses that dissolved boundaries between world and character. In the performances, themes found flesh. The protagonist's silence embodied inevitability and sacrifice. The driver's trembling loyalty embodied fragile connection. The strategist's collapse embodied the futility of control. The insider's hesitation embodied compromise and betrayal. Each character became less individual than vessel, carrying themes like burdens, mirroring the symbols around them. Their arcs were not simply narrative but philosophical, parables etched in flesh and gesture. Even the production itself mirrored the story's themes. The cracked mirror that shattered on set, the stray dog that refused to leave, the fireworks that interrupted, the lamp that flickered unpredictably, all were accidents turned into symbols. The crew endured budget cuts, storms, exhaustion, compromise, betrayal of plans. They survived by improvising, by surrendering control, by finding meaning in accidents. In making the film, they lived the film's philosophy. Survival itself is the only true victory, ambiguity the only resolution. And so, when we step back from plot and performance, from symbols and accidents, what remains is resonance. The film resonates not because it entertains, but because it insists on recognition. We recognize inevitability pressing in our own lives. We know compromise, betrayal, disillusionment. We laugh uneasily at absurdity, despair at futility, cling to fragile connections. We, too, live with ambiguity, with questions unanswered. The story lingers not as spectacle, but as mirror reflecting truths we would rather ignore but cannot escape. This, ultimately, is why the film matters. It dismantles genre expectations, stripping the glamour from the heist and replacing it with haunting meditation. It transforms familiar tropes into existential parables. It insists that theft is not only what happens in vaults but what happens in life, time stolen, trust stolen, certainty stolen. It reminds us that survival is not triumph but endurance, fragile and imperfect, yet still defiant. And in its ambiguity, it offers not comfort but recognition, a truth more lasting than any resolution could ever provide. As we close this exploration, I want to step out of the story for a moment and thank you for choosing to engage with cinema in this way, for choosing depth over distraction, for choosing to treat films not as escapes but as texts to be read, interpreted, and carried. It is no small thing, in a world overflowing with noise, to sit with ambiguity, to wrestle with themes, to embrace silence. By joining me here, you affirm that cinema is not just entertainment but literature, philosophy, meditation. And for that I am deeply grateful. If you have found value in this journey, if these themes have resonated with you, if you wish to continue exploring films as layered texts rather than surface stories, then I invite you warmly to subscribe to this channel. Not as routine, not as obligation, but as part of a fellowship of minds who read cinema like literature, who seek meaning in reflections and symbols, who believe that stories are worth lingering with long after credits roll. Each video here is crafted as an invitation, a conversation, a shared walk through the shadows and lights of film. By subscribing, you become part of this community of explorers, this circle of literature enthusiasts who know that cinema is never just seen but read, never just watched but lived. So let us continue together. Let us dive again into stories that resist neatness, stories that unsettle, stories that refuse closure. Let us keep peeling back layers, tracing themes, wrestling with symbols. Let us carry these truths into our own lives, finding recognition in ambiguity, endurance in futility, firelight in darkness. Until the next film, thank you for walking with me, for thinking deeply, for enduring silence. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop reading cinema as the mirror it has always been.